underneath different parts of the city, like where I am now, and there were actually volunteer crews out here searching for Nancy Guthrie over the weekend in some of these tunnels. Could there be a deal worked legally so that someone who has information about where Nancy Guthrie is could come forward, someone who may have been involved in the kidnapping could come forward and give the information without getting criminally in trouble?
For weeks, every conversation about Nancy Guthrie has started in the same place. Where is she? Where could she be? What happened after she stepped outside her front door and never returned? Every search team, every tip line, every theory has been circling that same empty point on the map where an answer should exist but does not. The silence around that question has only grown heavier with time, because no matter how much effort has gone into finding her, the result has remained the same. Nothing definitive. Nothing that closes the gap between what we know and what we need to know. But now something has shifted. And it is not a small shift. It is the kind of change that alters how a case feels before it ever officially changes what a case is. Because right now, the question is no longer just where. The question has moved somewhere far more uncomfortable. The question is whether someone already knows the answer and has known for longer than anyone realizes. That is where this story begins to take a different shape. Because Brian Entin, a reporter who has followed this case closely from the start, is not delivering his latest update in the way we have come to expect. He is not standing behind a desk speaking in careful possibilities. He is not listing theories or repeating what might have happened. He is standing at a location, a specific place that he wants people to see. And the way he talks about it is noticeably different. He is not speculating. He is not exploring options. He is pointing directly at something. That shift matters more than it first appears. Because when someone with that level of experience stops searching publicly and starts indicating something specific, it suggests that the information behind the scenes has begun to narrow. It suggests that the investigation is no longer expanding outward in every direction but is instead pulling inward towards something concrete. Something that may already be taking form as an answer. And then he introduces two words that immediately change the tone of everything surrounding this case. Family plan. At first glance, the phrase does not seem alarming. It sounds ordinary, almost harmless, something you might hear in an entirely different context without giving it a second thought. But here, in this moment, in the way it is said, it carries weight. It carries a kind of quiet seriousness that makes it impossible to ignore. Because now the questions are different. What location is he referring to? Why is that place connected to Nancy Guthrie? And what role could family possibly play in a case that until now has been treated as a search for a missing person? Those questions begin to reshape the narrative in a way that does not feel random. It begins to feel structured, intentional. The location that is now coming into focus does not appear to be accidental. It is not somewhere chosen in a moment of panic or confusion. It is a place that suggests familiarity. A place connected to routes that are not obvious to someone passing through. A place that aligns with movement patterns that investigators have been quietly analyzing since the earliest hours of the case. When you look at it alongside everything else that has been uncovered, it does not feel like coincidence. Brian Entin describes what makes this location important, and it is not just the physical space itself. It is how that space connects to the timeline, to the roads that were likely taken, to the paths that were avoided. The idea that someone moving through that area in the middle of the night would have needed to know exactly where to go and how to get there without drawing attention. That level of precision does not happen by chance. It does not come from someone making decisions in the moment. It comes from someone who already knew the route before the journey even began. And that realization shifts the entire direction of the case. Because before this, everything revolved around one question. Where is Nancy Guthrie? It felt open-ended, unresolved, something that could still move in any direction. But once a specific place enters the picture, the question changes. It becomes more focused, more deliberate. Why this location? Why this exact point on the map? Why does it keep appearing as investigators connect the details? That transition from where to why is not subtle. It is the moment a case begins to move away from uncertainty and toward the possibility of something planned. For a long time, Everything the public heard about the Nancy Guthrie case followed the same careful pattern. The search is ongoing. Every lead is being investigated. There is no confirmed location. The language remained controlled, deliberate, almost restrained. Nothing was said unless it could be backed by something solid. That is how serious investigations operate. They do not rush to conclusions. They build toward them slowly. But while that careful tone remained on the surface, something else was happening underneath. Because the evidence was not expanding outward the way an open search normally does. It was not spreading across multiple possibilities. It was narrowing. Quietly, consistently, almost invisibly, it was beginning to point in one direction. And that creates a tension that is hard to ignore. Two realities existing at the same time. On one side, official uncertainty. Statements that suggest the case is still wide open. On the other side, a pattern that does not look open at all. Pattern that looks focused, directed, almost certain in a way that has not yet been spoken out loud. That difference matters, because investigations often reach a point where what is known internally moves ahead of what is said publicly. Not because anyone is hiding information, but because proof takes time. You do not confirm what you suspect until you can stand behind it completely. And what we are seeing now feels like that exact moment. The moment before something shifts from suspicion into confirmation. To understand that shift, you have to go back to the night everything changed. Back to the moment when Nancy's phone signal dropped. Around 2 in the morning. That detail has always been treated as a timestamp. A marker of when contact was lost. But now it is starting to look like something else entirely. Not just when something happened, but how it happened. Because not long after that signal disappeared, another one appeared miles away. A secondary ping in a different location, moving in a direction that suggests something very specific. Movement had already taken place. Not slowly, not accidentally, but quickly enough that by the time anyone realized something was wrong, the situation had already changed. When those 2 points are placed side by side, they do not form a gap. They form a line, path, a route connecting one place to another. And when that route is examined more closely, something becomes clear. It does not follow the most obvious roads. It avoids them. It moves through quieter areas. Less traffic, less visibility, fewer cameras. That is not something that happens randomly. People do not accidentally avoid surveillance. They do not unknowingly choose the most discreet path in the middle of the night. That kind of movement suggests intention. It suggests awareness of the environment. It suggests someone who already knew where they were going before they ever started moving. And that realization changes the way every other detail is interpreted. Because once you accept that the route was intentional, everything connected to it becomes intentional as well. The timing, the direction, the destination, none of it feels like a reaction anymore. It feels like a plan. Which brings everything back to the phrase that has been echoing since the beginning of this shift. Family plan. Not as an accusation, but as a description. A way of understanding the level of familiarity required for something like this to happen without resistance, without noise, without chaos. Because when investigators look at the entry into Nancy's home, what stands out is not what is there. It is what is missing. There is no sign of forced entry. No evidence of a struggle at the door. No disruption that suggests panic or confrontation. Instead, what they see is control. Movement that appears deliberate, measured, almost practiced. That kind of entry does not come from a stranger. A stranger hesitates. A stranger makes mistakes. A stranger does not move through an unfamiliar space in complete silence. But someone who knows the layout, who understands the environment, who has been there before, moves differently. They do not guess. They act. And that is the difference investigators are now focused on. Not just what happened, but how it happened. Because the how reveals something the where never could. It reveals knowledge. It reveals familiarity. It reveals a level of access that changes the entire direction of the case. And once that becomes clear, the search is no longer just about finding a missing person. It becomes about understanding who had the ability to make something like this happen in the first place. Once that idea takes hold, everything begins to align in a way that is difficult to ignore. The digital evidence, the physical details, the timeline, none of them feel separate anymore. They begin to reinforce each other, each piece pointing toward the same conclusion from a different angle. Start with the digital trail. The silence of the phone was not random. Devices do not simply disappear from networks without a reason. They are turned off, disabled, or removed in a way that prevents them from being tracked. That alone suggests control. But when paired with the secondary signal that appears later, it suggests something more structured. Movement that follows a sequence. Then there are the communications investigators have been examining. Patterns that do not behave like coincidence. Messages that appear, stop, and resume in ways that align with key moments in the timeline. Not chaotic, not impulsive, but coordinated, as if more than one person understood what was happening and when it was happening. That level of coordination introduces a different possibility. That what occurred was not isolated, not a single moment of action, but something that involved awareness beyond one individual. That possibility changes the scale of the case. It expands it, but in a very specific direction. Now place that alongside the physical evidence. Again, the absence of disruption stands out. No signs of forced entry. No indication of resistance at the initial point of contact. The environment does not reflect panic. It reflects control. And that consistency between the digital and physical sides is what gives this pattern weight. Because when two completely different types of evidence begin telling the same story, it stops being coincidence. It becomes direction. And direction creates pressure. The kind of pressure that builds when an investigation starts to look like it has been narrowing for longer than anyone realized. That pressure is not just internal. It begins to surface publicly as well. Questions start to emerge. If the route appears this clear, if the location has been referenced multiple times, if the patterns have been pointing in the same direction, then why did it take so long for that direction to become the focus? That question does not come from doubt. It comes from clarity. From the realization that hindsight is revealing connections that may not have been fully recognized in real time. And in cases like this, time matters. Every delay carries weight. Every missed connection becomes more significant as the picture sharpens. But investigations are not perfect. Early stages are often chaotic. Information arrives in fragments. Priorities shift as new details emerge. What seems obvious later is not always obvious in the moment. That does not change the outcome, but it explains how time can pass before a pattern becomes clear. And now that pattern appears to be fully forming. The route, the location, the method, all of it aligning into something that feels less like possibility and more like intention. A sequence of actions that fit together too precisely to be accidental. Which brings the focus back to the central question. Not just where Nancy Guthrie is, but who had the knowledge required to create this sequence. Who understood the environment well enough to move through it without hesitation. Who had access not just to the location, but to the routine, the timing, the structure of her daily life. Because that level of access is not common. It is not something a random individual acquires easily. Comes from proximity, from familiarity, from being close enough to understand the details most people never see. And that is why the phrase family plan continues to hold weight. Not because it names a person, but because it defines a level of knowledge. A level that separates this case from something random and places it firmly in the category of something deliberate. Something that was not decided in a moment, but developed over time. As the investigation continues to narrow, the emotional weight of what is happening becomes harder to separate from the evidence itself. Because behind every data point, every timeline, every reconstructed route, there is a reality that cannot be reduced to analysis. Person is missing, family is waiting, and time continues to move forward without resolution. That passage of time changes things. In the beginning, uncertainty leaves room for hope. The possibility that answers will arrive quickly, that the outcome might still shift in a positive direction. But as days turn into weeks, and weeks into something longer, that hope begins to change shape. It becomes less about what might happen and more about what needs to be known. Not just where Nancy is, but what actually occurred. Because not knowing carries its own kind of weight. A constant absence that does not resolve, only deepens. That shift is reflected in the way those closest to the case have begun to speak. The tone is different now, less open-ended, more focused. The space for speculation has narrowed in the same way the investigation has. And what remains is a clear, direct need for answers. That urgency is mirrored in the work being done behind the scenes. Surveillance footage is not just being reviewed for new leads, but re-examined for confirmation. Paths are being reconstructed with greater precision, not to explore possibilities, but to validate what the evidence already suggests. The digital side continues to develop as well, tracking methods that follow communication patterns, financial traces, and encrypted exchanges. These systems do not rely on guesswork. They rely on persistence, on the idea that every action leaves some form of trace, even if it is not immediately visible. At the same time, physical evidence is being processed with equal care. Samples compared, details analyzed, each piece placed alongside the others, not to expand the search, but to close the gaps that remain. Because the goal is no longer discovery, it is confirmation. And all of it continues to point back to the same place. The same location that has appeared repeatedly as the investigation has progressed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but consistently, quietly reinforcing itself as the center of everything. That consistency is what makes it significant. Because in complex cases, the strongest leads are not always the most obvious ones. They are the ones that remain stable as everything else changes. The ones that continue to align with new information instead of being replaced by it. And that is exactly what this location has become. Not just a possibility, but a focal point. A place that represents more than geography. It represents intention. A decision made at some point before the events of that night ever unfolded. Which brings everything back to the question that now sits at the center of the investigation. Who had the knowledge to make that decision? Who understood the location well enough to choose it? Who had the access required to move through Nancy's world without creating the kind of disruption that would have immediately exposed what was happening? Those questions are no longer theoretical. They are the framework guiding everything that happens next. Because the difference between not knowing and almost knowing is where investigations reach their most critical point. And that is where this case appears to be now. Not at the beginning of a search, but at the edge of an answer. A point where the evidence has already formed a direction, and all that remains is the final step of confirming it publicly. Until that happens, the official language will likely remain the same. Careful, controlled, measured. But underneath that restraint, the trajectory is clear. Because when every piece of evidence continues to point to the same place, the same method, the same level of familiarity, it becomes increasingly difficult to see it as anything other than what it appears to be. Something intentional, something planned, something that began long before the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Brian Entin closes his report with a realization that has been forming quietly beneath every detail in this case. He suggests that this may no longer be about finding where Nancy Guthrie is. It may be about understanding who already knew exactly where she would be taken. That shift does not come with noise or urgency. It comes quietly, but it changes everything. Because it moves this case away from searching and into something far more precise. It becomes a matter of knowing, of tracing decisions instead of chasing possibilities. Someone understood the timing. Someone understood the route. Someone chose a location with enough certainty to move through the night without hesitation, without disruption, without leaving behind the kind of signs a stranger would. And if that is true, then the location itself may not be a mystery anymore. It may already exist within the framework of the investigation, not confirmed publicly, not announced, but recognized. Which means the case may no longer be operating as an open search. It may be moving toward confirmation, toward the point where what is already understood can finally be said out loud. Authorities continue to speak carefully. The language remains measured, controlled, deliberate. But beneath that restraint, the direction feels steady. Because if the patterns are as clear as they appear, then nothing about that night was accidental. Not the entry, not the movement, not the silence, not the place that continues to surface as everything else fades. This was not chance. It was intention. And somewhere between what is known and what has yet to be revealed, the answer may already be waiting.